Hey Tigers, Tony here. Welcome to today's Tony Talk. We have a great topic today. It's the Microsoft Copilot. And we're going to cover a lot of stuff. Consider this, we'll start off at a 100 level, then go gradually up to maybe a 200, possibly 300. We're going to cover everything in what is Copilot. We're going to talk about the Semantic Index, how Copilot works, what prompts are. We'll talk about the building blocks of both plugins and graph connectors. Data types, we'll do a demo where we will actually make our own Copilot. So we got a lot to cover. So let's get started. Tony Talk. All right, what is Copilot? In a nutshell, all Copilot is a processing and orchestration engine used to coordinate AI. And what it coordinates is the large language models, the contents in the Microsoft Graph, which we'll talk about, and the Microsoft 365 apps like Outlook, Word, or PowerPoint. What Copilot does, it utilizes general skills. We're not talking about just searching for text. We're actually talking about understanding, summarizing, predicting, recalling, translating, and even generating content. And what it uses as a baseline is all the knowledge that exists in Microsoft Graph, such as emails, chats, and documents. And I'm going to stress this several times throughout the talk, that it only uses permissions that a user has access to. All right, you've probably heard a lot of examples. For example, there's a lot of demos on using Copilot for Outlook. For example, you can ask it to summarize emails and flag important items. You can actually ask it to draft an email response about certain details and specific points. You can invite people to meetings at a specific time and topic. And you can even have Copilot create an email for you. So there's a lot of these videos. I'll put the link down in the description, so check them out. All right, let's talk about the large language models, LLMs. You probably heard the most famous one, GPT by OpenAI. And what LLMs do, they actually understand and generate language. So the reason why LLMs have been so in the news lately is because we can actually really utilize them because we have huge computer processing power. Now you combine that with huge amounts of data, and then you have a neural network. And what this neural network does, it learns the statistical patterns of the data, and it generates an output in text that is semantically meaningful to the user. So in other words, it acts human. Okay, before we go into how Copilot works, I want to just have a quick discussion on APIs. Now, an API stands for Application Programming Interface. And all this is how computer programs communicate with each other. Now, there are several types of APIs. I'm most familiar with REST and SOAP, but there's GraphQL and gRPC, for example. Now, it's very important to know that Microsoft Graph uses the REST API. And why does it use the REST API? Well, first of all, it's a very simple API to use and configure. It's flexible and it's cache friendly. And that's the key right there, being able to cache data. Okay, I don't want to geek out too much on APIs, but I want you at least to have the experience of identifying a REST API. So I've divided it into 5 different parts. The first part is called the HTTP method, and this is used to request Microsoft Graph. And it really determines what your request is going to do. The second block is the actual endpoint, the Microsoft Graph endpoint. And as you can see, this is just graph.microsoft.com. The third component is the version. This is the version of the Microsoft Graph API your application is using. And usually when you need to start to troubleshoot something, that's the first place you should look. And then there's the resource in the Microsoft Graph, and this is what you're referencing. And the final component is the method, the REST method parameters that customizes the response. So that's the REST API. And To configure the REST API method, use the Graph Explorer. All right, let's take a super simple example of how the semantic index works. So you have a user, and that user sends a prompt. And in this example, it's sending the prompt of find an email where a colleague was happy with the design work of a vendor. So the semantic index takes that prompt and it realizes you don't only mean happy, you might mean also elated, excited, or amazed. And it does this to broaden the semantic search. And then finally, it returns emails where you saw that colleagues were either happy, elated, or amazed with one of the vendors. All right, let's dig a little deeper. But I think the first place to start is let's look at traditional keyword index or keyword search. So all keyword index and keyword searching does, it really just does exact words and phrases. So for example, if you search Tony Talk presentations, it will look for Tony, it will look for talk, and it'll look for presentations. And typically when a user can't find what they want, they'll start saying, this doesn't understand what I'm asking it. And that's true. But with semantic search, you can say, show me Tony Talk presentations on constructing a value proposition by Tony Pellner. And it takes your input, and as you saw, adds a lot of words that are meaningful to you and should return the closest answer based off of your permissions to access certain data. All right, in addition, first of all the semantic indexes, you're probably familiar with Microsoft 365 search. This is the next version. This is the improved version of that. Now it sits on top of the Microsoft Graph. And what it does is it delivers search results that are personalized and elevated based on all the connections you have between content and people in your network. Now I'm going to say this 100 times. It respects the security and policies already in Microsoft Graph in context of the user. And if you want to manage or see the status of the semantic index, you use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center to see whether it's enabled or even if indexing is finished. All right, let's discuss how does the semantic index work? Well, first, it captures the semantic meaning of your query. So when you query something like dog, cat, or pet, it's been trained on those words by thousands of images and thousands of documents on dogs, cats, and pets. And what it does is it creates a conceptual map of information relationship between what is called vectors. Let me show you. So now you have the words dog, German Shepherd, and pet. Those all have meanings and they are mapped together by vectors. But you also could have wolf, types of wolf like a tundra wolf, and a zoo, and a cat. Now somehow that has some relationship to dog, but not as close as, for example, a German Shepherd. So what you see is, although wolf matches close to dog, zoo is much farther away from dog than wolf. And whereas a cat really is nothing like a wolf or a dog, it is a pet. So in the sphere of dogs, it does have a relation as pets to dogs. When the semantic index is done, it creates two indices. The first one is called a user level index, and the other one is called a tenant level index. And what the user level index has, it creates this personalized index for text-based content that either you created or you interacted with, such as emails, documents, and so on. However, at the text level index, this adds text-based SharePoint online files that have been accessed by 2 or more people in your organization. Now, the user level index stores this information wherever the user's mailbox is located. The tenant index is stored and isolated and protected in the customer's tenant in the location where the SharePoint site is located. Typical questions I get from customers and colleagues regarding the semantic index. First, as I already mentioned, it's an improvement of the Microsoft 365 search, so it cannot be disabled. Now, when indexing completes for the first time, any content that the user has indexed is captured real time. However, if you have a document and you have not shared it out, and then you share it out to more people, that index usually is done sometime that day. So to exempt a SharePoint site from semantic search, you do it the exact same way as you would do M365 search. Under the configurations, you just select no for this site to appear in search results. Now there's no option to exclude results from Microsoft Search only or Semantic Index only. Prompts, responses, and data access are not used to train LLMs, including the Microsoft Copilot. And finally, again, it only works with content in which users already have access to, and it doesn't affect storage quotas. All prompts are inputs or queries to elicit a specific response from an AI model. Effective prompt design is essential to achieving the desired outcome. So if you want your LLM AI models to bring back good results, you have to have good prompt design. And prompt engineering or prompt design is actually emerging as a field. And it involves selecting the right words or phrases or symbols and formats that guides all the AI models in generating high quality text. So when you're a prompt engineer, you have to know the subject very well. And when you work directly with these LLM models, you can also use other controls to influence the model's behavior. For example, you can use temperature parameters to control the randomness of the model output. And you kind of see how you're able to configure this in Bing Copilot. When you go to chat, it asks you what type of response do you want? Do you want a creative response? Do you want a more specific response? And that's how they do it with these parameters. There's also parameters called top K, top P, frequency, penalty, and all these influence the model's behavior. So if you really want to get into prompt engineering, I recommend you go look into those parameters. And again, as a prompt engineer, you'll use Visual Studio Code to integrate prompt engineering into your existing development process. And it's very simple, right? You create a prompt directly in the code editor, and then you deploy them to production using your existing continuous improvement or continuous development pipelines. Let's talk about how Copilot works. We've talked about the M365 apps. We've talked about the Microsoft Graph. We've talked about the Semantic Index. Both those live in the Microsoft 365 tenant. I've touched on LLMs, and now let's see how Copilot orchestrates this whole thing together. Well, first, a user sends a prompt from an M365 app to Copilot. For example, show me all the emails from my manager. And this is encrypted with HTTPS and URIs. And Copilot then accesses Graph and the Semantic Index for pre-processing. So what is pre-processing? So Copilot pre-processing prompt is done via grounding. So what is grounding? And what grounding does, it really improves the prompt by making calls to the Graph and Dataverse, and by accessing all the enterprise data, it makes the prompt more specific. And then finally, again, grounding locates all the documents and data using whatever RBAC controls are in place for you. Then Copilot sends the modified prompt to the LLMs. And here, this is where AI is performed on the input prompts and sends an output result. Now, Azure OpenAI is maintained and owned by Microsoft. And just so you know, I get this question a lot. OpenAI does not have access to the data or models. Then Copilot sends the information back to Graph in the Semantic Index for post-processing. Again, this includes additional grounding calls, and there's responsible AI checks, security compliance, privacy reviews, and command generation. And then finally, after all that's done, from the Microsoft tenant, Copilot sends the results back to the app that made the request to begin with. Okay, now a big area of Copilot is extensibility. And there are pretty much two ways to extend Copilot. The first way is through plugins, and plugins consist of message extensions, Power Platform connectors, and OpenAI plugins. And the second way is through the Graph connectors, and this is grounding it with your organization's data. All right, when it comes to extensibility, let's talk about what to use. Now, if you're a Power Platform user that wants to connect to your data, great. Very simply, all you have to do is create a Power Platform connector and connect it to your external data. Now, if you're not a Power Platform user and data needs to be indexed and you need to connect to data in Microsoft Search or Context IQ for Dynamics or any M365 apps, you do need to create a new connector using APIs or the SDK. And if that doesn't work, but you have existing message extension, you already have the foundation in place for a plugin because Copilot already exists. Now, if neither of those work for you, you still have the option to use the bot framework to build a really feature-rich solution. And if you're not familiar with the bot framework service from Microsoft, what it is the Azure AI component bot service that sends information between the user's bot connected app and the bot. Building blocks for plugins and graph connectors. For graph connectors, you have an API, and that is the Microsoft Graph API. And this you use to create connections and to ingest external data of items and activity. Then you have a schema. Now this is JSON definition file that is made of metadata that includes properties along with aliases, semantic labels, etc. And then you manage permissions. And this is a allow or deny list of users, groups, or anyone in your tenant. And this really defines the access to all the items. And remember, this applies to all the experiences. Now the plugin, there are some differences. So you do use an API, but you use a standard agnostic language descriptive interface to the RESTful APIs. Now, instead of a schema, you have a manifest file. And this is just a JSON file that describes how your app integrates into the M365 platform. And instead of permissions, you have something called an adaptive card. And you've probably seen this on SharePoint. And what this is a snippet of a UI, and it's also made in JSON, but it automatically adapts to the surroundings that you're in. Now let's talk about when to use a graph connector or a plugin. Well, as we stated already, use a graph connector to expand your organization's knowledge with connectors. Plugins, they enable users to interact directly with third-party apps and services from inside of Copilot. Now, if you need to use keyword search and retrieval, both are compatible for that. However, if you need to perform an action on behalf of the user, you have to use a plugin. On the other hand, if all you need to do is summarization and ideation by way of semantics and similarities around indexed content, you have to use the graph connector. Also, if you want to rank relevancy of content, graph connector. Now, don't worry, when it comes to security, responsible AI, both are compatible with that. And for the graph connector, use the M365 Copilot, Workplace Search, Viva Topics, Context IQ, and Feeds. But for plugin, use the M365 Copilot with Teams, Outlook, and other Office apps. All right, let's talk about data types. Actually, I probably should have put this first since this is where you'll want to start. So when your data is unstructured or flattened, use graph connectors. But if it's structured data, use message extension plugins. Now, if you have smaller requirements, up to 5 million items per connection, connectors are fine. But if you have high volumes of data, over 5 million items, you'll have to resort to plugins. Now, if your data requirements are less than 20 requests per second, connectors are fine. But if you need to go over 20 requests per second, you need to resort to plugins. And finally, connectors are read-only, whereas message extensions are writable. So now let's talk about using Microsoft Copilot Studio to create plugins. The first layer is called the creator layer. And there are 4 distinct types of plugins. You have prompt, which answers natural language queries using NLP and also uses natural language generation, or NLG techniques. There's flow. If you want to execute multiple step workflows using Microsoft Power Automate, use flow. Now connectors, they can connect to external data system or data sources using the Microsoft Power Platform connectors. And the 4th type of plugin is a topic. Topic plugins are single-turn conventional threads between a user and a copilot, and that can be created to answer a specific user's questions or queries. Then comes the plugin registry, and this stores and manages the plugin metadata and has the execution information. It's a single source of discovery for the plugins, and it allows the user to discover which integrated apps are available at the tenant level that they can use. And this is managed by the Microsoft Admin Center. And it also shows plugins available to the user. And then finally, there's the actual Copilot, right? There's Microsoft Copilot for Teams, Dynamics, and custom Copilots are made in this Microsoft Copilot Studio. All right, now I'm going to come to my favorite part of today's talk, is I'm going to give you a demo on using Copilot Studio, where you make your own Copilot, and you can really see how powerful and awesome it is. All right, here I'm in Copilot Studio. Let me create a new Copilot. And here I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to name my Copilot, which I'll call it Tony Talk Demo. And then I'm going to enter a website that I'll use to answer the questions. I'll enter the Microsoft website. I can only go 2 layers deep, so let me fix this. And then let me go to Advanced Options. And I'm going to add an icon, one of my own that I created. All right, everything looks good, so let me create it. And then it will send me an email when it's done. And this is the email. It took about 10 minutes. And now I'll open Copilot. And now I'm going to add a topic. And I'm going to add a blank topic. All right. First, I'm going to rename it Tony Talk Demo. Okay, and now I'm going to add a phrase. And the phrase I'm going to say is, let's see, I'll put, hello, Tony Talk AI. And then I'll add that. Okay, so it creates that phrase. Let me get some more screen space here. And then you see the little plus sign. That's going to give me options. So I'm going to send a message. And I'll write, hello, this is Bella from Tony Talk. Bella's my dog, as you know. And then I'll save that. Now I'm going to ask him a question. And it's going to be a multiple choice question. I'm asking him which Copilot are they interested in. Either M365 Copilot or Dynamics Copilot. All right, let me scroll down here. You see the conditions. And so they got to pick 1 or 2. So I'll add a message. If they ask for the M365 Copilot, I'll tell them, great, we've been focusing on that and pretty much you're at the right place. If they pick Dynamics Copilot, I'm just going to tell them to come back later. Okay, I'm going to save that. Now I'm going to go to the beaker and test my Copilot. I'm going to turn tracking on so it can follow the conversation. Say, here, hi, I'm Tony. Hello, I'm Tony Talk, virtual assistant. And I asked hello, so it's going to ask me a question. Which Copilot am I interested in? And then, of course, I tell it, great, we've been focusing on that, as you saw me enter. Now I'm going to ask them, what is Microsoft Copilot? It's going to go out to the Microsoft site and get a result, and it'll give a link plus a little definition from the site. This is incredible. All right, so now that we're done, let's publish it. All right, and after it's published, it actually creates a demo site, and you can go there. And here's the site. I asked if it could help with Copilot. It tells me what it is and gives me some links from the site. And then I ask, what is the difference between a plugin and a connector? Again, it goes to the site and it answers both questions. The first paragraph is a plugin, and second paragraph is a connector. All this is done without code. I think that's pretty incredible. Now let's talk about one of the most important topics, and that is incorporating third-party information. So graph connectors, they enable you to ingest the external data from a third-party source. Now, Microsoft indexes all the graph connectors. Now remember, these connectors work best when the content is in rich text. And third-party data can be hosted either on-premises or in your public cloud or your private cloud. And as of this talk, there's already more than 30 plugin and graph connectors, such as Bing, Microsoft Dataverse, Jira, and so on. Now, if data minimization needs to take place, like you have to deal with some sort of compliance like SOC or HIPAA, then you actually have to use Microsoft Purview, and it's a data lifecycle management. It's not automatically part of Copilot, and that does need to be licensed separately. And depending on what your data lifecycle needs are, this can be used to delete content that is no longer needed. It works with retention policies and retention labels for exceptions. All right, Tigers, in today's Tony Talk, we covered a lot on Microsoft Copilot. First, I told you what Copilot is. I said it's this orchestration engine between applications, the Microsoft tenant, and the LLM models. Then I introduced you to Microsoft Graph, which is just a gateway to all the data intelligence in the Microsoft 365 universe. Then we talked about LLMs, and I told you that LLMs are becoming very popular due to the massive compute power we have at our disposal, the amount of data we have at our disposal. And it creates these neural networks that actually act like humans. Then I give you an introduction about APIs. I told you that the REST API is the one that is utilized in Copilot. Then I talked about the Semantic Index, and I also discussed typical questions I get from colleagues and customers. Then I showed you how Copilot works, including the orchestration between the apps and the LLM. And also I talked about pre-processing and grounding, which really improves the query and delivers better results to the user. Then I talked about prompts, and I talked about how prompt engineering really is an art for inputs and queries to make sure that the user gets the specific response from the model they need. Then I talked about extensibility. I talked about plugins, specifically the OpenAI, the Power Platform, and the message extension. Then I talked about graph connectors, and then I talked about which plugin to use. And then I went even deeper when I talked about the building blocks of plugins and connectors, right? So the graph connector, for example, uses an API, a schema, and then permissions, whereas the plugin uses an API, a JSON manifest file, and an adaptive card. Then I discussed the graph connector or plugins and which one to use. So for example, if you are ranking and relevance, you use a graph connector and not a plugin. Then I talked about data types. Graph connectors are great for unstructured data, but if you have structured data, you're going to have to use message extensions. Then I talked about making a plugin in Microsoft Copilot Studio. I gave you a short demonstration on how I did that. Then I told you how to incorporate third-party information into Copilot. As of today, there's about 30 plugin and graph connectors you can use. And then finally, we talked about data lifecycle management. So if you have some compliance that you need to manage against, you can use Azure Purview, the data management lifecycle feature of that. All right, Tigers, I hope you enjoyed today's Tony Talk as much as I did. Please support the channel by liking and subscribing, and I'll see you soon.